The interrogation room was nothing more than a wooden shed reinforced with sandbags, half buried in the mud of the Western Front. A single lantern hung from a nail, its weak glow barely pushing back the darkness. It was late 1944, the air sharp with cold and the distant rumble of artillery rolling endlessly across the countryside. Inside, an American intelligence sergeant prepared himself for another long night. He had interrogated dozens of captured German soldiers, some defiant, some terrified, some silent, some broken. He thought he had seen every expression war could carve into a human face. Then they brought in the newest prisoner, a young German POW, mud still clinging to his boots, hands trembling despite the attempt to hide it. His uniform was torn, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but there was something else, something the sergeant could not quite place. Not arrogance, not fear, something different. The sergeant asked the first routine question. No answer. He tried another. Still nothing. Then finally, with a voice that wavered but did not break, the prisoner spoke a single sentence. And in that moment, the sergeant felt the breath leave his lungs. It wasn't information about troop movements. It wasn't a coded message. It wasn't even a confession. It was the truth the war had buried under rubble, smoke, and orders. Raw, devastating, and impossible to ignore. The kind of truth that forced even an interrogator to go silent. The final winter of the war settled heavily over Europe, thick with smoke, fog, and a kind of silence that felt forced rather than natural. Towns lay shattered, roads were broken into jagged paths of ice and mud, and forests stood stripped and skeletal after years of shelling. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, carrying on not through hope but momentum, because stopping felt more dangerous than moving forward. For the Americans pushing through France and toward the German border, the fighting had become unpredictable. One village might be abandoned, the next could be a trap. Prisoners were taken every day, some surrendering willingly, others only when they had no ammunition left to fire. Intelligence units worked constantly, trying to understand the shifting structure of German defenses as the Reich collapsed inward. Among these intelligence teams was a young American sergeant, someone who had never expected to become an interrogator. Before the war, he had been a clerk in a small-town office, more familiar with typewriters than rifles. But war had a way of repurposing men. His ability to read people, to notice the small details others missed, had moved him into a role that demanded patience rather than brute force. Across the front, German units were disintegrating. Some troops were barely more than teenagers conscripted in desperation. Others were veterans who had survived from Poland to France to the Eastern Front. Many believed they would never return home. Some no longer cared. Others clung to discipline because it was the only stability left. The prisoner brought in that night belonged to none of the usual categories. He was young, but not a boy. His uniform bore no special rank. He carried no medals, no signs of elite units. Yet he had survived an ambush that shattered his platoon and had been found alone near a burned-out farmhouse, wandering without direction. His capture had been uneventful, no struggle, no attempted escape. He had simply stopped walking when American rifles were raised. When the sergeant first saw him, something felt off. There was a kind of stillness in the prisoner that didn't match panic or resignation. He looked like someone carrying a weight that didn't belong to the battlefield. Protocol was straightforward: get the prisoner seated, offer water, establish basic identity, then move into questions about units, positions, and intentions. But from the moment the interrogation began, the usual rhythm fell apart. The prisoner avoided eye contact. His hands trembled not from fear, but from something deeper. And when he finally spoke, a single sentence, it didn't fit any intelligence report the sergeant had encountered. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't political. It was personal. And it shook the sergeant because it carried a truth that war usually buried beneath strict orders and hardened emotions. A truth that didn't come from a soldier to an enemy, but from one human being to another. The lantern flickered as a gust of cold air slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. The American sergeant leaned forward across the table, elbows planted firmly, pencil poised above his interrogation form. The German prisoner sat motionless on the opposite side, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. The sergeant repeated the question. slowly, clearly. Name. Unit. Regiment. Still nothing. The prisoner stared down at the rough wooden tabletop as though the grain lines held answers. He couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. His shoulders shook slightly, but he forced them still. His breathing was shallow, controlled, almost mechanical, like a man trying to stay composed while drowning. The sergeant had seen silence used as defiance. He had seen it used as fear. But this was neither. The silence had weight, meaning, intent. Look, the sergeant said, voice steady but firm. I'm not here to hurt you, but I need something. Anything. The prisoner finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into his bones. He swallowed hard, then parted his lips. My name, he began, but his voice cracked. He stopped, tried again, forcing himself through the words. My name is irrelevant. The sergeant blinked. That was not an answer, but it was something. He pressed gently. Not irrelevant to me. The prisoner looked at him with a hollow expression that should have belonged to someone twice his age. You won't understand, he whispered. The sergeant leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Try me. The prisoner clenched his jaw, staring at a knot in the wood between them. When he spoke again, the words came out brittle. My unit is gone. All of them. There is no regiment left to report. No officer left to give orders. No one left who cares about my name. A chill ran down the sergeant's spine. This didn't sound like a soldier hiding information. It sounded like a man stripped of identity by sheer loss. Still, protocol mattered. How did your unit fall? He asked. The prisoner winced, not at the question, but at the memory. His fingers twitched as though holding a rifle that no longer existed. We were ordered to hold a ridge, he said quietly. But the Americans shelled it. And then, he stopped. His throat tightened. He looked away, blinking hard. The sergeant waited. He understood that patience, not pressure, would reveal the truth. We were surrounded, the prisoner continued after a long pause. Half of us were killed before we even fired a shot. The rest tried to surrender. He swallowed again, fighting something inside him. That should have been the end, he whispered. But it wasn't. The sergeant's grip tightened on his pencil. What happened? The prisoner lowered his head. They shot us anyway. The words hung in the cold air like frost. The sergeant froze. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Who? He asked slowly. The prisoner's voice shook. Your men. The sergeant opened his mouth, then closed it again. His pulse hammered in his ears. He wasn't naive. He knew the war made monsters out of ordinary men. He had heard rumors, stories from the front, moments where discipline snapped and rage took over. But hearing it from the mouth of a prisoner, young, trembling, and visibly carrying survivor's guilt, made the truth feel unbearable. I wasn't there, the sergeant finally said. I know, the prisoner whispered. But I was. The shed felt smaller now, the lantern's glow suddenly harsher. The sergeant tried to regain control of the interrogation's direction. Why did they spare you? The prisoner hesitated. They didn't see me. I fell into a crater. I stayed there for hours while they walked over the bodies. The sergeant stared at him. You survived by accident. No, the prisoner murmured. I survived because I wished I hadn't. The sergeant's breath caught in his chest. This was not an interrogation anymore. It was a confession. A wound opened in real time. The sergeant braced himself, because something inside him knew the worst was still to come. Why did you finally speak? He asked. The prisoner's answer would turn the night from tense to devastating, shifting the power in the room and changing the interrogator's understanding of war forever. The lantern swayed gently, casting long, wavering shadows across the cramped interrogation room. The American sergeant felt the weight of the prisoner's words pressing down on him like the air before a storm. He stared at the young German POW, really stared at him, for the first time since he walked in. Not as an enemy, not as a source of intelligence, but as a man sitting inches from a truth too heavy for his narrow shoulders. The sergeant spoke quietly. "You said they shot your men. Why tell me this now?" The prisoner exhaled slowly, a tremor in his breath. "Because you asked why I stayed alive. And I needed to answer honestly." "But that isn't intelligence," the sergeant replied. "It doesn't help anyone out there." The prisoner raised his eyes. They were filled with something fragile, almost shame. "It helps me," he whispered. The sergeant sat very still. "I thought if I said it out loud, maybe it would feel less heavy. But it doesn't. It feels worse." The sergeant felt a tightness in his throat. This was beyond military procedure, beyond interrogation. This was the raw aftermath of a battle neither report books nor victory speeches ever captured. "You think I can't understand that?" the sergeant murmured. "You can't," the prisoner said gently, "because you weren't there. You didn't see it." The sergeant leaned forward. "Then tell me what you saw." The prisoner closed his eyes, steadying himself. When he spoke, his voice shook, but he did not stop. "We threw down our rifles. We raised our hands. My lieutenant called out in English. We stood in the open. We surrendered exactly as we were taught." He swallowed hard. "But the Americans kept firing." The sergeant felt something cold inside him harden. Why? Were they under fire? Were they provoked? The prisoner shook his head slowly. No. They were angry. Someone shouted that we were the reason his buddy died. Another shouted that we didn't deserve mercy. The sergeant's stomach twisted. The prisoner continued, each word slicing the space between them. "When my lieutenant fell, I ran to him. He was still alive. He told me to look away. I didn't. I watched him die with his hands in the air." The sergeant's grip tightened on the table's edge. "Why didn't you run?" he asked quietly. "I tried," the prisoner whispered. "But there was nowhere to go. And then the shell hit." The sergeant frowned. "A shell?" "Yes. From your artillery. It landed behind us. The ground collapsed. I fell into a crater. Bodies fell on top of me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And the Americans walked past, thinking we were all dead." The sergeant pressed a hand over his mouth. The prisoner leaned forward, eyes burning with something that resembled grief more than anger. "And when I crawled out, I wished I had stayed under the bodies." The room went silent. The sergeant had interrogated men who lied to save themselves, men who lied to protect their units, and men who lied because they were trained to. This wasn't a lie. This was the kind of truth a man only shared when he had nothing left to lose. The prisoner took a shaky breath. "That's why I said my name is irrelevant. Because there is no one left who knows it. No one left to remember it. No one left to care." The sergeant felt something break inside him. Not loyalty, not duty, but the part of his soul that war had been quietly eroding for months. He set his pencil down. "There's one person who cares," he said softly. The prisoner looked up, startled. "Me." The words stunned them both. Outside, the war continued. But inside the wooden shed, something shifted, a moment neither man would ever forget. A moment where enemy and interrogator faded, leaving only two human beings caught in a truth neither had asked for. The lantern's flame had shrunk to a faint glow, flickering against the draft that seeped through the wooden walls. Dawn was still hours away, but the night no longer felt cold. Not in the same way. The American sergeant sat with his hands folded, no longer interrogating, no longer recording, simply listening. The German prisoner sat across from him, drained, exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if speaking the truth had loosened a binding he'd carried for far too long. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, the sergeant rose from his chair. Not abruptly. Not with authority. Slowly, almost carefully, as if standing might break the fragile stillness between them. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "You survived something that would have destroyed anyone." The prisoner looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "But I didn't save anyone," he whispered. I didn't fight bravely. I didn't protect my men. I just hid. You lived, the sergeant said. There's a difference. The prisoner lowered his gaze. He seemed unable to accept the kindness, unable to reconcile it with the guilt clawing at him. He clasped his hands together again, as if trying to hold himself in place. The sergeant took a step closer. You think I haven't seen men break? He asked softly. I have. Every day. But what you told me tonight, that wasn't breaking. That was surviving truth. The prisoner blinked hard, and the sergeant realized he was fighting the instinct to apologize, for being alive, for being afraid, for being human in a war that punished humanity. Outside, boots crunched on the frozen ground. A guard passed the window, glancing in briefly. The war was still there. Ugly, loud, relentless. But inside the shed, something rare had happened. The front lines had briefly collapsed into silence. You'll be processed in the morning, the sergeant said. You'll get food, medical care. You won't be harmed here. The prisoner nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. Not fear of the Americans, but fear of being judged, for surviving when others hadn't. The sergeant hesitated, then extended his hand. No protocol. No interrogation. Just a gesture between two men who had seen too much. The prisoner's breath caught. Slowly, very slowly, he reached out and took the sergeant's hand. It wasn't strong. It wasn't confident. But it was deliberate, and it held a plea for something neither of them could fully name. When the sergeant let go, he opened the shed door. Cold morning air swept in. Come on, he said softly. Let's get you out of the dark. The prisoner rose, unsteady but upright, and stepped toward the faint light outside. Behind them, the interrogation room fell silent once more, holding the truth that had changed them both, and would follow them long after the war ended.